the limitations and constraints of trying to not be like a parent. So often when I'm coaching someone, we discover that the source of their limiting beliefs are decisions that they made in their childhood about how they did not want to be like their parent. They didn't want to be like mom, they didn't want to be like dad, or perhaps it's another authority figure that was prominent in your life in your early years, but most often it's a parental figure. For example, we discover that the source of their workaholism is that they had a parent that they perceived as lazy and weak and decided that they never wanted to be like that, and therefore they had to be a workaholic. Or someone who had a very angry parent and decided that they were never allowed to express anger, and instead they'd have to just internalize that anger because they don't want to be like that angry parent. Or someone who had a parent who they perceived to be out of control and decided that they need to be in control all of the time so as not to be like their parent, and therefore develop an eating disorder. Or someone who had a parent whom they perceived to be codependent and needy in relationships, and therefore decided that they would never allow themselves to depend on another person and develop intimacy and vulnerability issues as a result. These decisions that we make in childhood about never wanting to be like our parents are a form of what I call protective decisions. I call them protective decisions because, thunder, yeah. Because we make them in response to something that doesn't feel good, something that hurts. Often we make these decisions in response to witnessing the suffering of a parent. So we see a parent that is needy and dependent in a relationship, and we're watching how that causes them to suffer. And we love our parent so much, and we decide that we don't ever want to suffer like that. So therefore, we are going to be the opposite of whatever way we perceive our parent to be. This form of protective decision goes like this, and I'll let you fill in the blanks here. Do your own transformational ad-libs with this one. So it goes, I perceive my blank, my mom, my dad, my uncle, my teacher, to be blank, a way of being that you perceive them to be codependent, to be needy, to be selfish, to be angry, etc., which creates suffering. Therefore, I must be blank so as not to create suffering like them. On my next slide, I'll have that whole thing written out so that you can pause on it and fill those blanks in for yourself so that you can get the most out of the rest of this Insta coaching. The next thing that I want for you to identify is around what age did you make this decision? And I want you to keep that age in mind because it's going to be an important part of the healing process and undoing the constraint and the limitations that this decision has put on you and your life. But before we get into the healing process, I want to talk about why this work and this inquiry is so important, because so many of us who made decisions from a young age about how we don't want to be like our parents, we think that those are really empowering decisions. Like, well, I'm going to be strong and independent and not be like my weak, pathetic dad, for example. And I want to really point out what's in most of our blind spots, what we can't see about how that decision is really limiting what's possible for us in our lives. Whenever we make a protective decision about, I can't be this way, so I'm going to have to be this way, we are necessarily killing off possibility. It is in those moments that we create our fixed identity. Our fixed identity is a box that we put ourselves in of ways of being that we've decided we're allowed to be, and on the outside of that box is ways of being that we're not allowed. And so from that point forward, from when we make that protective decision for the rest of our lives until we take the time to heal and correct that protective decision, we are not choosing freely to be these ways, but we are reacting to the past. We're reacting to a moment in the past where we were scared and we made a decision about who we would have to be. And we sentenced ourselves to, I have to be these ways from this point forward. It's not an empowering place to be. So for example, if from a young age you decided that you needed to be kind so as not to be like your mom who is an asshole, then every moment forward when you're being kind, it's not actually a free, empowered choice. It's something that you sentenced yourself to. It's a fearful reaction to the past. It's a fearful reaction to being like your parent. So you don't get to create who you want to be in each moment, because you've put yourself in a prison of this fixed identity that you created for yourself. And in moments that it would serve you to be some way other than kind, or some way other than independent, or some way other than in control, you feel like you don't have an option to be another way, because it doesn't feel safe to be those ways. And it doesn't feel safe because the consciousness, the belief system, the emotional body, the mental body of that child that you were when you made this protective decision, that consciousness still lives within you. And remember, that child believed, that child decided that if they were like that parent, then they would suffer like that parent, or they would cause suffering like that parent. So that child, that 5-year-old, that 8-year-old, however old, remember that age that you identified earlier in this conversation, that child is still terrified of enduring or creating that level of suffering. So, for example, if that child decided that they had to always be kind and suppress their anger so as not to create the kind of suffering that daddy created for mommy, for example, then it's not enough to just decide to start being self-expressed with your emotions. You must first have a conversation with that inner child within you that's terrified of you being more self-expressed. Because to the inner child, being more self-expressed means creating and enduring suffering. That inner child needs to understand that the protective decision that we made so long ago isn't actually protecting us. It's like a shield with inward spikes. It has the illusion that it's protecting us on the outside, but really it's just creating hurt and suffering for us nonstop, because it's preventing us from being able to be who we want to be. It's preventing us from the freedom to get to create ourselves, to be whomever and however we want to be in each moment. So as a recap here, the first thing to do is identify what was the protective decision that I made, in response to what did I make that decision, and at what age was I when I made that decision. And then the next thing to do is to identify the negative impact that that decision has had on your life, the shadow aspect, the disempowering aspect of that decision. Identifying the negative impact is an important part of bringing that blind spot into your awareness so that you can actually do something about it. You can act on it rather than it constraining you from the background. So once you've identified all of those things, then it becomes about exposure therapy. It becomes about being willing to feel whatever it was that you weren't willing to feel when you were younger, in response to which you made that protective decision. So turning up that willingness to feel that vulnerability, to feel that fear, to feel whatever you feel when you step outside of that box of your identity that you constructed. And you will start to feel those emotions when you start being the ways of being that you long ago decided you weren't allowed to be. So for example, if you decided long ago that you always have to be in control in order to avoid being like a parent who is out of control, and in order to avoid you having to feel those things that you felt when that parent was out of control, when you start letting go of control, you are bound to have those feelings and those sensations and those memories come up in some way, shape, or form. So this is where the willingness piece becomes really important. And also, this is where the inner child work becomes really important, because remember, your inner child made that protective decision because your child didn't want to have to feel the things that he or she was feeling back then. So it's really important to support that scared child through whatever he or she is feeling in the process of you starting to be willing to feel these emotions and start being these ways that you long ago decided it wasn't safe to be. And knowing that any resistance that you experience as you're starting to step outside of your fixed identity is really the resistance and the fear of your inner child. So your job is to show up for that inner child and to comfort that aspect of yourself that is afraid of stepping outside the box of your fixed identity. Another really important aspect of this, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you all, I think that I could lead a whole weekend retreat on this particular concept. There's a lot here. Another important aspect of healing here is to forgive that parent and be willing to perceive them differently. So if you perceived your parent as weak for whatever actions they took when you were a child, consider that perhaps they were exhibiting strength, that perhaps there was some aspect of what they were doing and how they were being that was actually strong, that was actually brave. Because remember, the more you judge that way of being or that aspect of your parent, the more you judge it within yourself. And the goal here is to have the freedom to be able to choose any way of being that would serve whatever you're committed to in any moment. And when we judge a way of being in another, we prevent ourselves from owning that way of being, which is just inherently limiting.